So welcome back. I hope you enjoyed your lunch. This is the Health and Wellbeing panel, and I'm Ilana Singh, a professor of neuroscience and society here in Oxford in the Department of Psychiatry. And I'm really delighted to be here. This is a new group of people to interact with for me. I've started recently doing nature-based interventions for mental health research, which I'll talk about a little bit later, but I just wanted to say how delighted I am to be in this amazing space with a lot of incredible people doing work that I'm really learning more and more about and how important it is. So we're going to talk today about interconnectedness of human well-being and ecosystem flourishing. And as this morning, we're going to have a number of different things going on. We're going to start with a keynote and have a few questions after that, but then we'll move fairly quickly into a panel, and we'll have panelists who are giving individual interventions. And what we're trying really to do in this session is to talk about our research and the kinds of opportunities that we see at the intersection of nature-based solutions and health and well-being, but specifically want to be talking about what we know about the benefits of nature for health and well-being. We want to think about better alignment between health, climate, and the nature agenda. And we also want to think really specifically about how we get nature-based solutions into health policy. So we're going to try to give some practical action-oriented thoughts towards that as well. So I'll start by introducing our keynote speaker. I'm delighted to introduce Professor Kathy Willis, who is Professor of Biodiversity in the Department of Biology and also Principal of St. Edmund's Hall here in Oxford. She's a crossbench peer in the House of Lords and was previously the Director of Science at the Royal Botanic Gardens at Kew. And she's also a member of the UK Government Natural Capital Committee. So Kathy's going to talk to us about good nature. Thanks very much, Kathy.
So thank you very much, and it's wonderful to be here. And actually, the last time I went to a conference, which was really, I'm going to move that out of the way, really mixing cultural aspects of nature and culture and values with science, was actually in Hawaii a number of years ago, where at the beginning of every talk, the speaker sung a native Hawaiian song, except for me, because I didn't know one, and sadly I can't do that today, but next time I will know. But it was a fantastic conference. Right, so this is the title of my talk, Good Nature. And over the last 3 years, I've been pulling together the evidence base to really understand what happens to us physiologically and psychologically when we interact with nature. So the importance, just the start, of access to green space is now really widely recognised in policy, and we need to start at that point. I think most people get that we need access to green space. If you look at the UK policy, you look at the Environmental Improvement Plan, came out last February, you know, the public should be able to access green space or water, such as woodlands, wetlands, parks and rivers, within a 15-minute walk from their home. You can take it into the international at the COP Biodiversity last year, Target 16, which is being embedded into many governments who signed up to the targets. Target 16 is to significantly increase the areas and access to green space in urban areas to improve human health and well-being. So the focus of this access to nature in cities and beyond is very much about and very much sort of pushed forwards by the increasing evidence base that access to nature is good for population level improved physical and mental well-being. And there are literally hundreds of these studies coming out right now. If I see another one, I think I will scream. So this one came out, this is nothing against this one, but this one came out in the Lancet in last October 2023. They looked at 2.3 million adults in Wales over a 10-year period, so huge data set, and found that exposure to green space over time, there's a lower odds of subsequent common mental diseases, that every additional 300 metres to the nearest green or blue space was associated with higher odds of these common mental diseases, and that the positive effects on mental health appear to be greater in more deprived quintiles. So really, really important for all aspects of population. But the point I also want to make is not just mental health, it's also physical health. There's many, many studies out there. This is one I really like because it's in Ontario, where they've got a biobank so they can look at all the medical records. They've also mapped every single tree in Ontario. And so they have the relationship between the number of trees you have in a street or an area and your health, and showed very strong significance here that you have significantly better or less cardiometabolic conditions if you have more trees in the area, and people feel better physically, and there's a whole swathe of data out there. But, and this is the real but in here, what sort of green space are we talking about? So if I walk 15 minutes from here, I can go to the Botanic Gardens, which is beautiful, or I can go to, that's my dog for scale, I can go to the university football pitches, I can go to the university parks, I can go to the Cutterslow Orchard community orchard even, and I can go and walk in a wooded area such as Whiteham. So all of these are classified as green space, but are they all equal in terms of the health benefits that you get from them? And this is a really important question because increasingly social prescribing is becoming the go-to answer to many organisations. And we have it, and I mean, I see there's one, there's the university parks every week. I just was in the Radcliffe Science Library. And these are fantastic and really, really important. But there is a big problem here, and I've talked to many medics about this. They're not quite sure where to tell people to go and walk. Do they all have the same impact, or can we start to understand the elements of nature that have a greater impact on our health and well-being? And I would argue, and when you're thinking about policy particularly, and thinking about wanting the medical community at large to embrace nature as an alternative to prescription drugs, we need to start to think of a framing that puts nature in the same place in terms of the evidence base we need in order to prescribe it. So it's not to say that, I mean, I have an inherent love of nature, but if you're going to prescribe it for someone with a particular condition, there are a number of things we need to be doing in that framing. The first one is what specific interactions with nature have positive physical and mental health outcomes. Is all nature equal? Well, we probably guess already from what I'm saying it's not. So effectively in a prescribing it would be what type of drug should I use for this condition? But the next really important thing is what actually happens to us when we interact with nature, both physiologically and psychologically, or is it just a general well-being feeling? The third thing is how long do we actually need to interact? Will 5 minutes do, or do we need to do half an hour or more? And finally, and this is the thing which really gets the Treasury going and policymakers going and the National Health Service going, is what's the relative efficacy of interacting with nature compared to prescription drugs? So is it as good, or is it an add-on, or can it be used as an alternative? So in the next 20 minutes, I'm going to try, or maybe less than that, try and address these questions and highlight the knowledge gaps, which hopefully then will flush out and lead into the discussion afterwards. So the current focus of interactions with health, I would say, are based around our senses. And I'm going to do this talk around the senses because, first of all, and I call them green senses, first of all, we've got the sight. And that is the one that most of us immediately think about, the sight of the vision of the landscape. The one we don't think about so much, but is really important, is smell. What are the volatile organic compounds being given out by nature and plants and fungi in that environment? What's the sound? Now, as I walked in, I heard fantastic bird sound in the archway, so I get that's already been looked at here. Touch. What about touch and touching different wood surfaces? What does that do? And finally, the fifth sense is taste. Now, it's not taste itself, and I'm going to use a slightly different one here, which is actually the hidden bacterial communities that we have in the environment around us, the so-called environmental microbiome. I haven't got time to talk about all of them, but I'm going to touch on 3 of them, smell, sight, and the environmental microbiome, and go through those questions. of what are the specific interactions that lead to positive physical and mental health outcomes, and what happens to us when our senses interact with them. So let's just start with a really simple one for sight. I love this one. This woman is not blindfolded. I think it's to try and anonymise her face. But anyway, they did a lovely study where they effectively had just people looking at screenshots of forests versus a city screen. So the sort of thing you'd see when you look out your office window if you work in London. And they measured these 3 different parameters: heart rate variability, brain activity, and psychological well-being index. And what they found very, very clearly, very statistically significant, is that within 90 seconds, when you look at a green image versus the city image, you have a psychological calming going on. Your heart rate goes down and your brainwave activity is such that it's indicating psychological calming. And in terms of your psychological measurements, you're very much more comfortable when you see onto a green landscape out the window than an urban one. But what are we talking about? Is it colour that's doing this, or the shape? I love this study. It's because they used heterohelix, the ivy leaf. Ivy is very, very promiscuous, and it hybridizes all the time. So you get all these different coloured leaves in there. So they showed these different shapes of leaves to people, and they measured their brain activity, they measured their eye movement, and they actually did psychological well-being indexes. And what did they find from this? What they found is that if we're looking at colours, you're most calm when you look at yellow and green and yellow and white leaves. Actually, when you're not calm is when they're red. So think about poinsettia on the Christmas table, and you'll realise it's not a good thing to have. But that's also true of eye fixation, and it's green and green-white in terms of likes and dislikes. But it's not just the colour, and this is a really important point to make. It's also the shape and how many trees or how much vegetation you have on a landscape. So when you look at a landscape or look at these sorts of things, I mean, you can see different shapes, but actually what our eyes are doing, first of all, they look at the overall landscape, and then they look at the outline. And what our eyes are actually doing are picking out the fractal dimensions of that outline. Now, within nature has many, many fractal dimensions in it. So if you look at that branch there at the top, go down to the next, the twigs, they're the same pattern. Twiglets, the same pattern further down. And so what you're seeing is a repeated pattern. If it's constantly repeated, it's 2. It's a fractal dimension of 2. If there's no repetition, it's 0. So nature tends to be between 1.3 and 1.8 in terms of its fractal dimensions. So when you look at a landscape, what your eye's doing is looking at the fractal dimension of that landscape. So 3 landscapes here, and I've put the fractal dimension on there on that outline. The one at the top is coniferous forest, up and down. It's got a fractal dimension of 1.5. Next one's a savanna landscape, few trees on an open landscape, 1.3. And the bottom here is cityscape, 1.2. Now, what they did was they looked at, they did computer-generated fractal dimension pictures, and then they measured the brainwave activity when people looked at these different fractal dimensions to see which one, or does one of those, lead to greater calmness. So I'm going to try right now with all of you. Okay, 4 fractal pictures. Take 1 second to look at them. Right, put your hand up if A makes you feel calmest. Okay, B, C, and D. Right, so it's between A and B, which is a great relief to me because, in fact, 1.32, between 1.1 and 1.32 was when you all said it made you feel calmer. And that's exactly what they found when they looked at this properly measuring the brain activity. It was this one, 1.32 had the biggest effects. And it had the biggest effects in your heightened alpha frequency, which is a component associated with increased wakefulness. It reduced delta frequency, which makes you more sleepy, and this one here, heightened beta frequency, which is associated with increased external focus. Now, which landscape does that come back to? This one. And it's very interesting. There's quite a lot of theory about out of Africa and whether or not that's deep in our evolutionary genes, and I'm not going to go there, but I think there's some very interesting. But think about Capability Brown. Think about the landscapes around Stowe and Blenheim. Think about where you most think that's a really relaxing landscape. More often than not, well, for me, it's not a coniferous forest. Okay, let's move on quickly because of time. Next one is probably my favourite, and where I've got research now going on as part of the Leverhulme Nature Recovery Network, is to do with smell. So smell, think about lavender, think about all those things that they spray on your pillow, but if you're not careful, it's very quickly, by skeptics, it goes into the voodoo science box, and people just ignore it. But what they're now showing is there are not many of these scents given out that, yes, they do actually have a physiological and psychological response. And they've shown it in babies as well. So it's not just cultural. It's not just you have a nice memory associated with that smell. So limonene is probably the most well-known one in citrus fruit, but many of the pine species here. And again, what they showed is your heart rate variability, and your heart rate is lower when you smell this, and you'll feel much more comfortable. However, this is the interesting thing about smell. It's not just you breathe it in and then breathe it out again. When you breathe in volatile organic compounds, they pass across your lung membrane into your blood. And in your blood, some of them interact in the same way as taking a prescription drug. In sense, calming, anti-anxiety drugs, there are many emerging through here. And just to show you this, so they're here, people walking in the forest. The one at the top is where I've put the green box in there. This is pinene in the air. So that's the ambient air in the forest. These are people who walked in the forest before. That's their blood, in their blood. This is the people who walked, this is the same people, this is their blood after they've walked in the forest. So it's absolutely there in their blood. It makes you slightly nervous about walking in forests. I have to say, your blood composition is going to change. However, let me show you why it's good. So this is my favorite experiment, which now has gone on to be replicated and published in journals like Toxicology. They had 12 men in a room for 3 nights, measured their blood, their urine, etc., and they pushed out hinoki from the Japanese cypress. What they found after 3 nights is these men had much, much lower adrenaline hormone in their blood. They're much calmer. But this is the most interesting. They had elevated natural killer cells. Now, those natural killer cells are the ones that attack viruses and cancers. So this is an enhanced immune response. Now, does that work when we walk in a forest? This is a lovely published, this came out Oncotarget 2018. And in here, what they did, they first looked at people, they looked at natural killer cells in blood of 180 university colleagues who lived in houses close to the forest, and compared them to 110 colleagues living in an urban environment. And then they sent some people off into 25 individuals on a 5-day hike into the forest. What did they find? Well, first of all, the percentage of natural killer cells was significantly higher in those people that live close to the forest. So they have an enhanced immune function, if you like, because of where they're living. And that was particularly the case in people who are particularly ill, those with hypoglycemia, for example. But the second one to me is a really important take-home message. It comes back to how long do you do these things for. Those that went on the trip to the forest, 5 days later, they still had elevated natural killer cells in their blood. So the response remained. Right, one more example, and this time the environmental microbiome, and in a sense, a hidden sense. Now, many of us now know about the microbiome because of all the work that's going on the gut microbiome. And many of you might know that, in fact, that there's also the same microbiome is all around us, especially in biodiverse environments. And this theory about the biodiversity hypothesis was put forward many years ago, saying the more biodiverse environment we have, the better the environmental microbiome, the better it is for us. And that's because when we're in that environment, that our gut adopts the signature of the environment we're in terms of the microbiome. But what does it do? So this is a lovely experiment where they had children in play school. Half of them were in an area that they brought soil in from the boreal forest. The other half had just a normal sand pit. And so you've got very biodiverse, non-biodiverse. 28 days later, they measured their bloods and also their microbiome in their gut. What did they find? Well, 28 days later, huge difference. The children that played in the soil that we mixed into the sand had a really, really rich gut microbiome. But even more important, they had a significantly increased number of T cells in their blood, and these are the good T cells that indicate an enhanced immune system. So the idea of letting children play in dirt is absolutely guaranteed. It has to be the right sort of dirt, but this is a very good example. So what sort of, my dog's back, what sort of environment are we talking about here? Well, work that's been done in Adelaide shows that the more biodiversity you get in the environment around the park, the better the microbiome. And in fact, where the dog is, has a higher level of pathogenic bacteria than a good one. So we don't want the dog there or anybody else there, in fact. Right, so very quickly for the last couple of slides then, how long do we need to interact to get these benefits? So this was a lovely study carried out in America, University of Michigan, and they got participants, faculty, to walk in these environments, and they measured their salivary amylase as a measure, or cortisol as a measure of stress. And they either ran or they walked, or sat. That looks good. And as I say, they measured their salivary biomarkers because it's a really good measure of stress. So what did they find? Well, they found you got 7 to 14 minutes, 15 to 20 minutes, 21 to 30 minutes, or 30 minutes and above. And if I put the line there, effectively what it's saying is massive drop, or the big, massive effect is 20 to 30 minutes, but you don't get any more effect if you stay beyond that. So 20 minutes is about right. And there's 3 other studies that have come out recently to show this. Now, I haven't got the slides to show this because of time, but what they also found, which I love, is that sitting down is probably the best. So you don't have to run. So the last question then is, what is the relative efficacy of interacting? Because this is the question I'm always asked then by the people who are looking at the money. And this is a lovely study, but there's like 2 of these out there. And they looked at cognitive behavioral therapy versus going to this garden. This was at the University of Copenhagen. And these were very mentally ill people who'd been off work for a year. And so they did 20 times 1 hour sessions over 10 weeks, or they did 3 weekly sessions over 10 weeks in the garden. And they looked at things like, number of GP visits and how many went back to work, and also how long they then remained at work. And what they found is that both were very effective, which one I was pleased, obviously you'd expect CBT to be effective, but it was as effective. They equal scores. But the interesting, they basically, both they led to this decreased number of contacts with a physician. But 77% of those who underwent the nature-based therapy were not on sick leave 12 months after completing the treatment, compared to 60% on CBT. Now, to me, that's a really interesting, if I'd had to guess or even estimate, I would have put it the other way around. So there seems to be something in there that meant that you got a longer term benefit in there. And of course, the CBT, this is why and that needs a lot more work, but because of course the costs are very, very different. The cost base of that is very, very different. Okay, so just to wrap up, and then a few final points, then I will stop. If I look at which specific interactions, what I've been trying to say in here, it's sights, it smells, sounds, all of these have slightly different interactions, and they can be physiological and psychological, and both. But for me, some of the most interesting emerging evidence is with smell and with the environmental microbiome. But the point being, there's a huge variation, and not all nature is good. What happens? Well, as I say, they can be calming, etc., but some of the things coming through now are much more about what's happening in our bloods and how they're acting in exactly the same way as prescription drugs and doing the same thing, but in a much more stacked benefit way. How long do we need to interact? At least 20 minutes. But there's less than 10 studies published on this to date. So while we're doing all these studies on population health levels and showing people need to be nearer to green space, we should do a lot more studies in this area. And finally, what's the efficacy? Well, there certainly seems to be the evidence coming through is that they can be much cheaper and as effective. Yet I can only really find 5 studies that I would say were worthy right now. That sounds patronising, but they are a big enough sample size to make them something that I think we could use in policy. So a few final thoughts, and then my time is well and truly up. I always put in this quote, I love this, nature is the physician of diseases, goes a long way back. We know currently that non-communicable diseases kill 71% and 41 million people globally each year. So these are stress-related and mental-related diseases. This is really a huge problem now. We also know that interaction with certain sorts of nature can provide effective treatments for many of these conditions. And the evidence base is growing on this very rapidly. But in many cases, we're still not approaching nature in the same way that we do with a prescription drug. And whether we have a value base that says we shouldn't be putting an economic value on nature, if we want the medical profession at large to embrace this, we have to give them the evidence base in which they can say this is an effective treatment. And so I would argue my last point here is that I would say we do need to learn from other branches of medicine on how to create the right research framework and fill these many knowledge gaps that are out there so that we can really embrace nature's got so many stacked benefits and health is one of them, but we need to be looking at it in this slightly more scientific, I would say, or more quantitative way in order to demonstrate those benefits to the right communities. Thank you.
I was wondering if you are aware of any studies that link the uplift in either mental or physical well-being with the state of nature intactness.
So I didn't hear that. Could you say that?
Are there any studies that look at the link between the uplift in mental and physical well-being and the state of nature intactness?
The last word.
Intactness.
Intactness. Sorry. No is the answer. But it's a really, really good question. And something that, because if we're going to find positive solutions, it needs to be, we've restored this area. Actually, that's not true. Where people are finding it, it's not in intactness, but they are finding it in community orchards. They're finding it in when people join in with allotments, when people are starting to do guerrilla gardening. You're also finding pockets of improved physical and mental health when those go through. And there are nice studies showing that, but not in the broader intactness as I would think of in terms of biology. But that's where we should be looking.
Thank you. There is another question online which maybe overlaps slightly with this question, which is, does the evidence for nature on health and well-being vary depending on global location? Because we live in a relatively benign natural world here in the UK and Europe, but elsewhere, of course, it can be much more hazardous to spend time in nature.
I think, the evidence, there are many ways of answering that, and I know the time is short. I think there are differences. There are cultural differences, certainly, about where, and one of the ones I was thinking about was actually about we like our wildflower meadows. We see them because but actually in China, that they find that really stressful, and it increases their stress levels. But, they really like their ordered flowers and ordered flower beds. And so that's an interesting, those sorts of things. But in terms of landscapes, there's been some really interesting studies that show even if you grew up in West Africa, you still prefer and are more calm in a more open landscape with a few scattered trees, even if you've never been outside that forested environment. So I think there are some generalities in here that also can be applied wherever.
Thank you, Kathy. Well, this conversation will continue on the panel. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Can I invite the panel to come up? Welcome. So I'm just going to introduce our panel briefly, and then each of us is going to give a brief, about a 7-minute intervention. We won't take questions between those, just because that will be awkward, but please save your questions and then we'll have questions at the end. So joining us online is Dr. Rob MacDonald. He's the lead scientist for Nature-Based Solutions and lead scientist for Europe at the Nature Conservancy. And joining us here is Dr. Penny Murage, who's an environmental epidemiologist at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. And Dr. Marco Aurelio Carvalho, who's a clinical psychologist and sustainability scientist who introduced eco-psychology in Brazil. So welcome, all of you. Thank you for joining us today. So I'm actually going to be giving the first intervention. So as I said before, I am a professor of neuroscience and society here in Oxford, and working with some amazing colleagues at the Leverhulme Centre for Nature Recovery and also in the Agile program. So I'm very pleased to be here to talk to you just a little bit about our work. And a lot of our work, well, some of our work overlaps with things that, that Kathy has been saying. So it's a real privilege also to be sharing a stage here and to think collectively about how to move forward. So I'll actually sit on this slide, and I'll first just talk a little bit about how we have come at this. So, you know, it's interesting to be in the first session this morning and to hear about bringing nature-based solutions into an area where nature-based solutions might be a new idea about how to drive progress and change. Because, I mean, as Kathy has described, in the mental health and well-being world, nature-based solutions are here. There's so much accumulating evidence. You know, every time we go back to the literature, so we see more and more papers coming out, and really from a wide range of disciplines, which is also really interesting to see. But as Kathy has also noted, the evidence is flawed, as we might say, from a scientific perspective. And I want to be very clear here that, you know, science is not the only kind of standard that we can adhere to. So, but for us, thinking about how we're going to use this in an evidence-based way, we have to be interrogating what that, you know, what that scientific database looks like. And there are a number of different kinds of problems. One of them, just fundamentally, and we heard this also in the panel this morning, is that what is nature? So nature is really just poorly defined, inconsistently defined. What is green space? That's another blue space that you see coming up again and again in the literature. But also from the mental health perspective, what is well-being? Well-being is really not very well defined in the literature. Neither is happiness. These sort of positive psychology outcomes tend to be variously defined. And often subjectively defined. So we have a lot of subjective report data in the psychology world. And similarly with mental health. The literature also is quite poor at defining populations. So are these universal interventions? Are they targeted to a particular kind of mental health population? There are lots and lots of studies with very small numbers. They're uncontrolled. And perhaps most important for us is that there's no explanatory pathway provided. So we don't know what's driving change. So if you don't understand the underlying mechanisms and your interventions don't target those underlying mechanisms, then you can't say that your intervention is driving change at an underlying systemic level. And we have ideas about what those target mechanisms might be from literature like the mindfulness-based literature. So awe, gratitude, compassion, curiosity, these are qualities that people generally will report when having nature-based experiences. But note also that these are individual level reports. So if we're moving up from the individual level to a systemic level, we don't have a lot of granular data to grapple with. And so, you know, we do have a green social prescribing program in this country, if we've heard about, but we can't answer questions about dose. How much, for whom, for how long, with what effects? And that is a real problem if you're going to be talking about it as a nature prescription, as Kathy has said. So the question, I think, for us today here is, not to kvetch on about the evidence, because we can do that, but, what do we need to do to actually bring together policy initiatives and nature-based evidence interventions so that we can have an evidence-based solution to how we use and facilitate people to work in nature for mental health and well-being. So what I'd like to suggest is that one of the things we need is a better model. And so one of the things we've been working on is a model which we call ecological collective flourishing. And so I won't go too much into where we get the idea of flourishing from, but this is a proposal for a way of thinking about well-being, which is based in a concept of flourishing, that human beings flourish in different ways, and that each of these ways is good in and of itself. But one of these ways, in terms of nature-based solutions, is better. So there's competitive, individual human flourishing, there's collaborative, collective human flourishing, so groups of humans flourishing side by side. And then there is what we call ecological collective flourishing, which is flourishing with nature. And it's worth saying that a lot of the literature at the moment in the mental health world, which is looking at nature-based solutions, is using nature, right? How can we use nature for human good? So that's using nature instrumentally. And we argue that actually what we need to do to really get back to kind of a holistic view of flourishing is that we need to be working with nature. We shouldn't just be using nature, we should be working with nature so that we flourish together. So we really think of ecological, we take this ecological idea very seriously, that we are part of nature, and that if we're going to really study well-being and nature-based solutions, we need to have tools and metrics that allow us not just to study human well-being, but also to study the well-being of the natural world that we're interacting with through these interventions. And for that, we need a new toolkit. So we need a toolkit that allows us to study, oops, this has really gotten messed up, sorry. But basically it's saying there's objective human health, there's subjective human health, but there's also objective nature health and subjective nature health. And how do we study these in one paradigm together when we're doing these nature-based solution studies for mental health and well-being, assuming that human well-being is not exclusive of the well-being of the natural world. So this is where we're trying to go in the work that we're doing. And we're also trying to do this in a multi-system way, so that we're looking at what we call the micro, the meso, and the macro level system. I think I've lost a slide here that I wanted to show you our model. But basically having a logic model where we are able to really build hypotheses on not just on the individual level, which psychology is very good at, but really thinking also on what we call the meso level, so family, community, workplace, and on the macro level, thinking about socio-political drivers, health inequalities, these kinds of drivers, and how we can build those into our models so that we can think about mechanisms at these different levels that drive positive change for human health and for planetary health. And I just want to end, because I know our colleagues are going to really add to this discussion, by saying that, you know, when I go out into the internet, so this was just this morning, I see everywhere these amazing community initiatives that have been around for ages. So this is just one in Los Angeles called Tree People, which has been around for 30 years, apparently. And these are, you know, school-based initiatives where they have a range of kinds of different interventions that they do with kids. And it looks fantastic. And you know, globally, we know that these exist. You know, Scandinavia is incredible at doing this kind of work. But we don't have sort of a common way of wrapping what I would say, wrapping science around all of these initiatives. So, you know, how do we actually work with policymakers, with local governments, to help address the evidence gaps we have using all of this wisdom that is out there? You know, can we scale up our knowledge just by collecting all of this and then retroactively fitting our models to them, as an example? That seems to me to be something that is well worth doing. So we work with community groups to try to leverage existing programs and leverage all of this really, really positive goodwill to nature and nature-based solutions for mental health and well-being to get more data and get more evidence. And what this means for us is that we can go to these local communities and we can, in a sense, turn things into living laboratories. And that's what I think we need to really be thinking about doing. Thank you. And I'm going to move on to introducing Penny. No, oh, sorry, Rob. Rob, where are you?
Hi, everyone. I'm very sorry I couldn't be there in person. And I will keep my intervention short, not least of which because I'm just a voice, and a face on a screen, which is not the most compelling way to give some remarks. But I'll share just a few quick slides. So I just wanted to start, first of all, by offering a sort of a perspective on the keynote that we just heard. So it's easy to think about nature and hear all these benefits of in terms of mental health, physical health, and feel like the ideal world is that we're all back on those savannas in Africa. But that's not the world we live in, right? This is the urban world we live in. You all are sitting on the island of the UK, and you can see what it looks like at space. So we're an urban species, 50% or more of humanity is in cities, another 2 billion people in cities by 2050. And so I think it's good to keep two things in mind as we talk about nature and health. This is one idea I want to just leave you with. There's a balancing act here, right? So man was once called the social animal, and going way back there. And I think Ed Glaser called cities our greatest invention. So what he meant by that was we've created this space that enables us being social, that enables interaction. And because of that, it generates immense economic productivity, innovation, and there are many things that scale really positively with density. So I've showed you one, this is energy efficiency. So dense cities are really crucial for being low carbon, but there are many other things that are really positive about cities. And I would guess that most people in the audience live in cities. And yet at the same time, there is something really inhumane about cities. There's this interesting long-term trajectory where, and this comes out of a literature that started there in the UK, in the 17th, 18th, 19th century, there was a fairly clear urban death penalty. So people in cities lived shorter lives. They died more often of air pollution, water pollution. So a lot of the 20th century was clearing up those problems and making our cities healthy. What seems like it remains is this mental health and maybe a physical health penalty, although the physical health piece is less clear. So the panelists before me and the keynote talked about some of those challenges to mental health of not having access to nature, right? Of being in this density. And this is a picture here of Penn Station in New York City, which is one of the ugliest train stations in the world, but also is just, to me, a place that exemplifies how dense cities can feel. And so a lot of my research and a lot of my work with urban planners and landscape architects is thinking about how do you get both of these goals, right? How can you have cities that are both dense and have all those benefits in terms of sustainability, but also have nature? And we won't have time to get into in this intervention the different pathways, but there are some pathways where you can be both dense and green. So the second idea I wanted to leave you with was just about the multiple pathways to health and multiple benefits nature provides and how they operate at different spatial scales. So I think particularly about urban tree canopy a lot. So one type of nature, and it provides at least all these benefits you see on the screen. Some of these are health related, but other ones are related to property values and managing stormwater, et cetera. And they play out at different scale. So a lot of what we talked about so far in this session has been around mental health, and that arguably relates to that sort of 15-minute scale. Where are people interacting in their daily life? If you think about urban heat islands, which is something I often think about, that's very local. So it's the trees around people's house within, say, 100 meters. And then if you are working with a stormwater utility to think about managing stormwater through urban green infrastructure, that's at the scale of that catchment, right? And so the benefit you want to provide and who you want to provide it to determines where you work. I was asked to speak briefly and sort of put on the table climate mitigation as an important benefit. And certainly the Nature Conservancy plans for the benefits of NbS to mitigation, which we sometimes call natural climate solutions, in many, many places around the world. And we think of it in these three buckets, right? So you can protect natural areas that have a lot of carbon. You can manage working lands better. So you're keeping more carbon in agricultural systems, for example, by doing no-till agriculture, or you can restore systems. So there's a lot of discussion in Europe right now around restoring peatlands, for instance. And so overall, our estimate is that might sequester 11 gigatons of carbon. It's a wedge of what we need, and maybe an important cost-effective wedge, but it's by no means everything we have to provide. So in the longer term, certainly by 2050, humanity desperately needs to get off fossil fuels. That's the only real path to avoiding really serious climate impacts, which will have huge impacts on human health. So I actually work more, though, on adaptation, and in recent years, especially on urban heat. Often in the US, although now that I'm based in Europe, thinking more in Europe as well. This is a statistic that I've pulled out in one of my studies in the US. So tree cover is crucial for reducing ambient outdoor air temperatures. There's a link to human health, but it's also very unequally distributed. So I think we should keep that in mind. In US cities, about 92% of US cities show this clear inequality, where high-income neighborhoods have more tree cover and lower temperatures and better health outcomes than low-income neighborhoods. So that kind of inequality is important because as climate change ramps up, this is going to be an important protective health benefit that nature is providing. So my own research suggests that in the US, trees currently save about 1,200 lives a year and have the potential to save around 500 more. So trees are doing a lot. They could do much more for health and climate change, but we're providing those benefits primarily to white, upper income families in the US, certainly, and that seems to be the trend globally. So we've talked primarily in this panel so far about mental health, but I want us to broaden to some of these other pathways and think about this equity question: who is getting access to nature? Finally, I'll just say, if nature is so wonderful, why are cities not providing more of it? One reason that I want to put on the table is just this idea that the agency that has to provide urban tree canopy or build parks, that has to pay those costs, is not the agency who thinks about public health. It's not the agency who plans for climate change. And so what we need to do is start linking through finances and through planning these two agendas so that we're getting to a place where if there are real health benefits, and I think the evidence is clear there are, for urban nature, then there's funding from the health sector to help support that nature. And there's also co-planning so that those planning urban parks are really directly engaging with those in the public health sector. So I'll stop there and I'll pass back to the moderator. Thanks for listening.
Thanks very much, Rob. And we're going to save questions until the end. And now we have Dr. Penny Maragi talking.
So maybe I'll start with a provocation. So I work in environmental epidemiology, and what that means is that we're interested in understanding the quote-unquote harmful effect of exposure to the natural environment. But I also love nature, and I think there's a lot of benefits that we can get from nature-based solutions. This is a conflict I have doing my work, is how do I use very rigid epidemiological methods to work on nature-based solutions and trying to link the health impacts of nature-based solutions. So what I'm trying to show here is a series of projects that we've been working on. I'm not going to go into a lot of details about most of them. I'll probably pick one and then kind of drill down on that idea of the methodological divide and how we come to that place of alignment. But maybe just to highlight number 7 there, this is a publication that we've been working with conservation colleagues at the UNEP World Conservation Monitoring Center, where we really try to sit down and try and think of what is this divide between health and ecology, and what are the practical steps that we need to be implementing in order to address that divide. So we are hoping that publication will be out in the coming weeks, months even. So keep an eye on that. But in terms of my day-to-day work, maybe I'll just focus the conversation today on what I'd call our flagship research project. So this is a piece of work where we want to understand the impacts, the health and well-being impacts of an implemented solution. So the solution is farmer-managed natural regeneration. It's actually ongoing work, working with our wonderful collaborators who are based in Tanzania. It's a small NGO, it's called Lead Foundation, and a huge credit to the work that they are doing, transforming the landscape. The landscape is really dry lands, but what they're doing is intentionally integrating trees in the agricultural landscapes. And back in 2021, we went there and we spoke to the communities because we wanted to understand from their perspective what are the health and well-being benefits. And they gave us this long list of ways that they experience the health and well-being benefits, and we have a publication that's out there if you want to read it. But I just want to focus on a very specific benefit, which was this idea of heat adaptation. Yeah, so a lot of the community there are farmers. They work outdoor. It's not mechanized farming, as you can see from the lady there. And a lot of them tend to work in open fields. So you can begin to see the impacts on health of working in open fields versus working under a shade. And so when we spoke to the farmers there, they kept repeating this idea of microclimate. I mean, that's not the language they use, but they said, it's cooler, it's better to work under the shade. We now have less dehydration and all sorts of other benefits, but that's really anecdotal, right? So what we want to do in this evaluation is to test that empirically, and it's not easy. I wish it was easy, but what I've done there on the left-hand side is list some of the problems and some of the challenges that we have to overcome to generate this really critical and comprehensive evidence. So in the middle of that screen is just an idea of this idea of a pathway design that we are trying to implement or to use in the analysis. And what we want to do is to measure exactly what's happening at the ecosystem level. There was a question about the intactness of the ecosystem. So we'll be looking at things like biodiversity, tree species, tree height, the canopy size, and all sorts of things related to the ecosystem. And then in the middle part is what is that ecosystem generating in terms of the ecosystem services. So we'll be measuring temperature and humidity and solar radiation and all wonderful things. And then on the very last side, and this is where my focus is on my expertise, is what are the physiological changes that we can detect in the human population. So we are really interested in this idea of bodies being able to regulate their temperature. So we'll be measuring core body temperature, for example. So you're asking them to wear wearables around their waist, and we collect that data when they're outside working. We're really interested in things like kidney injury, so we'll be collecting urine samples and blood samples to test kidney injury, but also dehydration. It sounds simple, but it's actually really costly, and you often need a huge, large sample size to even detect those simple effect sizes at a population level. So I'm not going to go into a lot of details about the methodological difficulties, but maybe I'll mention 2 or 3 things. The first one, from a public health perspective or from a medical perspective, if you want to do that sort of evaluation, what we tend to do is randomized controlled trials, right? So you do this in a very controlled experimental setting. It's impossible to do that for NbS, and that's one of the critical challenges. So in an RCT or in a trial, we'll take a control population and an intervention population, and we'll follow them. But actually, trees take years and years to grow, so we can't do an RCT. I guess the other challenges is that, how do we measure those microclimatic changes? It's not in my gift, but we are working with a really brilliant group called Meta who do that analysis and that measuring those parameters for us. And the last thing maybe I want to mention is this idea of thresholds for health outcomes and dose response. It came out earlier, actually. So if we want the evidence to be convincing for public health or for medical professionals, we really need to understand or answer that question of exactly how many trees are we talking about? Is it the tree species that's important? Is it the number of trees? Is it the size of the canopies? What is it about the trees that's affecting health? Really, really difficult to answer. This is my last slide. So I was asked to talk about, a key action or what do we need to get to where we want to get. And for me, it's the idea of transdisciplinarity, which kind of extends beyond multidiscipline working. I'm really sorry, there's lots of overlap there, but it's the idea that we need to transcend disciplinary or siloed working to a state where we are working all together. One of the things that stops me from doing cross-disciplinary work is some of the systems, existing systems, particularly with research funding. And I don't think the current research funding mechanism allows us to do ambitious research as we'd want to. So I'll give a really quick example before I conclude. I often find that I have to tone down the message depending on the funder. So if it's a predominantly health-based funder, I tone down the NbS component because they won't understand it, right? And if it's a nature-based funder, I have to tone down the health component. And I was telling someone earlier about this, that we recently submitted a grant application to a natural environment funder, and it was really highly rated. It was never funded, but the criticism was that health and well-being was a distraction. True story, true story. So how do we change, how do you get from there to where we want to get? And I think there are huge lessons that we can learn from indigenous populations. So on the left-hand side is a quote, or right-hand side, it's a quote from the focus group discussions. And this particular farmer told us that the thing that motivated them to continue with their intervention was because they could see the health and well-being and social economic benefits. So that was a huge driver for conservation. And in their eyes, they don't necessarily separate out the health and the ecosystem benefits. It's all in one, it's all one holistic picture. And I think that's what we need to learn as researchers, that this artificial boundary between health and ecology is exactly that. It's just an artificial boundary. And maybe just to conclude, the last thing I want to say is that what else can we learn where there's been a lot of progress? And I think climate change and health research is literally decades away from where we need to be in terms of that cross-disciplinary or transdisciplinarily working. Okay, I'll stop there. I think I've overrun time, but thank you very much.
Hello, I would like to thank the conference organizers for the invitation, and the person of Professor Natalie, all her colleagues, and all members of the panel. I would like to tell you how two public organizations and two private organizations came together with one focus: to combine the field of health with the field of nature protection in the heart of Brazil. But before to tell you about, I would like to say, trees and forests are the most remarkable and ingenious technology to support us in the era of climate collapse. We need to reconceptualize what they are and get to know them in depth, but not only through scientific data, but also through sensitive experience and the heartfelt and affectionate realization that our fate is linked to theirs. The background to this story is eco-psychology, an interdisciplinary approach that seeks to create a bridge between two areas, psychology and ecology. This approach works on the principle that health is a concept associated with the quality of the relationships. Human health is derived from the quality of relationships between people, but we can take the relations with the more than human world, ecosystems, and the planet out of the question. of this equation, excuse me. The health of the human species depends on the health of the ecosystems. Ecopsychology recognizes that must be a link between healing the mind and restoring the earth. Methodologies that deepen the relationship with the natural world are studied and created within the eco-psychological movement, which is organized internationally around the International Ecopsychology Society, and in Brazil, the Brazilian Institute of Ecopsychology. It was in this context of research into the reconnective methodologies that the practice of Shinrin-yoku, forest bathing, or nature bathing, came to our attention in Brazil. No other outdoor practice has received so much attention from science. A quick search on Google Scholar will turn up approximately 280,000 results. There are impressive effects on the immune systems, depression, anxiety, stress. Well, presentation of Professor Kathy says everything. What I am about to tell you explicitly links the two areas. It's the Forest Bath Project, a seminar called Dialogues held in 2017 by Chico Mendes Biodiversity Institute, the federal government agency responsible for the conservation of federal areas in Brazil, addressed the issue of the relationship between health and nature. This seminar generated important results. I was invited to address the topic, and I did so using the practice of forest bathing as an example. The following day, I led the first ever made forest bathing in a national park. Fiocruz, the most important public health research organization in the country, responsible for the production of vaccines and medicines, was also represented at the seminar. And soon after, we started planning a research project to replicate and expand the research done in other biomes, North Hemisphere, on the forests, on the effects of the practice when carried out in Brazilian biomes. An agreement was signed between Fiocruz and the Brazilian Institute of Ecopsychology for the forest bathing project, with the aim of systematizing, generating evidence on the benefits of human health, disseminating and encouraging the implementation of the forest bathing experience in public and private natural areas. More broadly, the overall aim of the project is to encourage society to get closer to natural areas, interweaving the paths that lead to human health, nature conservation, and the generation of socio-economic benefits. The project's specific objectives are: one, to qualify and define guidelines and protocols for forest bathing experiences. Two, to train forest bathing facilitators theoretically and practically. Three, define guidelines for the process of certification and or recognition of natural areas suitable for forest bathing experiences. Four, draw up a communication, relationship, and engagement plan with a view to raising public awareness of the theme of health and nature, generating engagement with natural areas, and fostering partnerships. Five, drawing up, implementing, and evaluating a research project and monitoring the health of those taking part in the activity to assess the benefits of forest bathing when carried out in Brazilian biomes. Six, promote an advocacy campaign to influence public policies in the health, environmental, education, and tourism sectors in the context of health and nature theme. A second consequence of that seminar was the mobilization of the scientific community interested in the area of health and nature, together with environmental activists, into a working group. This group was responsible for a manifesto addressed to the Minister of the Environment, who is currently a prominent environmentalist, Marina Silva, in the sense of the need to integrate public policies that connect the two areas. Fiocruz is currently working on the research design and already has the resources to start it. The research will initially be carried out in Brasilia National Park. And here comes another important player, WWF Brazil. This location was chosen through a partnership with WWF, which in Brazil coordinates the initiatives of the Healthy Parks, Healthy People program. WWF Brazil and the Brazilian Institute of Ecopsychology set up a program to offer free forest bathing to the park visitors. At the moment, 22 guides are being professionally trained based on educational criteria created within the framework of the agreement. The guides, in return, will offer the practice to visitors for a year, starting at the end of July, that is, in a few more weeks. In partnership with the managers of the Brazilian National Park, the trails have been marked out, where the training of future guides is now taking place. We will be able to offer forest baths to up 192 people per weekend in 6 sessions lasting 2 to 3 hours. A total of up to 9,216 people we have benefited from the experience after 1 year. Well, to finish, we are dramatically in need of evolving towards a time when humanity will find its place within the web of life, when the exuberance of life will grow with our presence instead of dying out as we currently do. Rediscovering our links with forest is an important step toward this. Our cities need the support of this incredible technology that springs from the earth to deal with the hotspots they create. Forest bathing generates enchantment, love and gratitude for trees and forests. At the very moment of the practice, you can feel your unbreakable bond with them. After feeling this, it becomes easier to understand our place in the planet and to feel that the forests need to be protected and that our future is connected with their future. May the time come soon by the safety of all forms of life. And this conference is great to meet people trying to do their bit. Thank you.
And I'm sorry to cut you short. I think we are all overly enthusiastic about this topic, so we've all run over our times. Can I ask if there are any questions from the audience for our panelists? Yes.
Okay, so my name is Stella Napanu from Kenya, from northern Kenya. And mine is not really a question, but a reflection to all of us. Like, all we've had the experts or the panelists say is this intricate connection between nature and our well-being. But then what we are missing here is understanding that we are also nature. It's the same way as saying, I want to have a balanced diet, but then you just choose to have rice only. That is how we're doing it. We are literally isolating ourselves, and that is why we're facing all these challenges. And anyone in the health sector and in the environment sector, I'd like to also, ask if there is any studies showing that indigenous people face mental health issues. You might say it is not fully researched, but then if you really look at the cases of mental health, you'll find them in cities, in places where there is no nature, because we are literally isolating ourselves from ourselves. We have to understand that. We really have to understand that the trees are us, the grasses are us, everything is us. So how do you expect a hand, assuming you cut off your hand and you want it to do every other function, how do you expect it to walk? How do you expect it to eat? It does not have a mouth. So let's not forget that aspect as well. So studies should also be done on indigenous people, comparing indigenous people, mental health and their well-being, and people in cities. Thank you.
Thank you. I think that is such an important observation and really important for us to remember. I don't know if any of the panelists want to respond in particular.
I mean, I don't know how to respond to that. I It's quite powerful. I think you're right. I mean, one of the things that we really want to measure, I don't want to use the word measure, but to examine is the idea of eco-anxiety in the rural populations in Tanzania, because it's true that the landscape is changing, their livelihoods are being affected, and mental health has not been assessed fully as it should be. Thanks.
Yes. And in indigenous communities in America, for example, of course, there are mental health and well-being effects of being an oppressed people as well. And so we haven't yet looked at what the nature resilience might bring for that. But of course, that's also an important aspect to remember in that context, is that oppressive history. Yes.
Thank you very much. I think it sort of connects into that and a couple of the conversations we heard earlier on, but I'm interested if there's any thoughts or research into the role of either risk or fear or sort of that side of the emotive response to being in nature. And I mean, particularly in developed Western world, I think we now replicate an experience that sort of an emotional experience that may have been part of us, you know, when we lived a much more natural way of life through taking part in adventurous activities. So whether it's been done in sort of Western communities from that setting or more indigenous communities, or, you know, in landscapes where there is a much more obvious risk.
We're going to answer your question, but then we're also going to come back to a response that Marco has to the previous question. Kathy.
Just to answer your question, there has been some work done on the whole thing about stress and psychological calming and the density of trees, for example, in urban streets, and showing that beyond the threshold, I think it's about 35% of your vision, if it's got too many trees, your stress levels go up, not down. So there's a really interesting interaction there, which does come back and could well come back to actually our relationship with forests, our relationship with the environment, and you know, as a woman, if I'm in a really quite a dense urban area with lots of trees, I don't feel safe. So there's a flight and fight response that's been done. Some really good work's been done by people at the University of Surrey on this whole question about, you know, not all nature is good. And that's the other thing, you know, is we dash to plant trees everywhere for urban cooling and for carbon sequestration. We also have to be very careful about what sort of environment we're creating and whether or not that environment does our relationship with that aspect of nature. Because I agree, we are part of nature. I always used to make my students say, do you believe you're in the ecosystem or outside the ecosystem? And I always had split numbers of votes there. So I think there is work going on that. And I think it's a really important part about the benefits of nature.
Yes. The basic fact is that we are nature, really. But we need to admit that we suffer from a damage in this bond between us and nature. So it's possible to say that I can have a relationship with nature, even I am nature. And what we're trying with this project, with the way we practice forest bathing, is to go more ahead than the basic effects and physiological effects of forest bathing. The forest bathing, as we saw, it has incredible effects. But when you go deeper, the forest bathing experience put the person in a so sensitive state, so communing state, that is possible to retake the sense of pertaining and a deep connection with nature. For example, we are doing forest bathing with 2-3 hours experience. 20 minutes would be enough to some effects. But when you are thinking about a deep experience of feeling, being part, in my personal experience, is necessary more time. So we are offering this practice with scientific evidence, but there is another point here. It's necessary to go deeper in this sense of pertainment, and it is what our this practice is able to do. So.
Thank you, Marco. So we have time for one more question, which I'll take from online, and then I'll come back to the panelists for to ask you perhaps to give us your action items. Although Penny, you've already given us your action items, which is terrific. So there's a question online that says, "How does proximity to nature compare with looking at nature in art?" And I wonder if anybody has any knowledge of that.
Well, maybe Rob would like to answer that. I don't know. I feel I've hogged the microphone here.
I actually had can I make a quick follow-up comment to the previous bit of discussion, although I guess it's related. I mean, I just think as we talk about this, that there's some interesting discussion online about this idea of what is good nature. Someone used that. I think the word nature here is misleading in a way. I mean, we're talking about the cities and a created space, and we are designing that space. And so it's, for me, helpful to have a longer term history. So 300 or 400 years ago, cities around the world had almost no nature. In fact, they were considered sort of the opposite of nature, right? There was no street trees, there was no public parks, and we've created nature in cities for specific reasons, to whether it's psychological or physical, or places to recreate, or democracy trees. You can find that term around the French Revolution. So to me, the word nature implies this. There's a narrative that's sometimes out there among environmentalists and many of my colleagues at TNC, right, that it's sort of a back to wilderness idea, right? Like the closer we got to that natural world, the better we would be in terms of health. But I do think in cities, we're in a different space. We're creating that space. And I think that's to me what good means. It's about what characteristics of nature, what kinds of green space are going to give us these health responses that we want out of our urban nature. And it doesn't matter, in a sense, how close that is to the wilderness experience, to me at least.
Thanks, Rob. That's super helpful. I think it is important to think about urban nature as well, of course, as nature, all the different kinds of nature that exist. Shall we try, Kathy, did you have a response to the nature and art question?
Nature and art question, I mean, the answer to that is yes. I mean, in fact, nature out of the window, they've shown that if you just keep looking out of the window, you can get as many benefits as, not everyone can go into the wilderness. And I don't think the discussion is about wilderness, it's about nature in cities and looking onto nature. Even a picture can bring about psychological calming. A bunch of flowers on your desk will lower your blood pressure compared to no flowers. We can bring nature indoors, green walls, getting children in the classroom to play with soil. They don't have to be out in wilderness. So I completely agree with that, Rob. But I think it's about embracing all aspects of nature, but embracing those that we know or the evidence base shows have the more benefits. So if I'm going to, I diffuse hinoki oil now in my bedroom, not surprisingly. But so that's fine. I'm getting that smell of nature, and it's completely false in a sense. It's been distilled from the hinoki leaves, and it's now puffing in my bedroom. That's not nature, but it's an aspect of nature that I know, I hope, will bring about the benefits that I'm not going to get. I'm not going to go and sleep in a hinoki forest. That's not going to happen. So, so pictures on walls are great, basically.
Really interesting evidence. And of course, I know that I don't know this literature, but I know there are people doing work on digital nature and exposures in the digital context, which is, of course, an important piece of progress for access concerns. So I'm going to ask all of you to do the difficult thing of maybe leaving us with one action. And Penny, you gave us several actions, so perhaps you want to underline the one that is sort of your highest priority action. So maybe I'll start with who feels prepared to give an action or a priority action. Kathy, how about you?
Okay, I think my action is something from just working from this book. You don't have to wait to be prescribed nature. You can embrace nature and all its benefits, its health benefits now. And I think we should all be doing that in our own lives and in those around us, because that's how we'll build up nature and our valuing and bring back our knowledge of what nature, our relationship to nature, and that we're part of it.
Thank you. Rob, I'm going to go to you.
Yeah, I would say increase the nature in your own life and fight for it, advocate for it in your neighborhood. I think if people care about nature near where they live, there'll be a lot more of it.
Thank you. Penny?
I'd like to build on that cross-disciplinary working action a little bit more, I guess, but also say that there seems to be a huge focus on mental health benefits. Please, let's not forget some of the other physical benefits that are generated by ecosystem services that are really key. You know, everything from mitigation of air quality to mitigation of water quality and soil quality, particularly quite visible in the most fragile ecosystems where a lot of vulnerable people live. So yeah, and I think when it comes to generating the evidence, I think there's a lot of focus on urban areas, but please let's not forget the rural areas and rural communities as well.
Yeah, I think that prescribing nature really is, and is important to the public policies that doctors, psychiatrists, psychologists, psychotherapists, they prescribing nature is a kind of pressure to the forests more available inside the cities too. So yeah.
Thank you. And I think a lot of the online comments that we weren't able to get to, and I'm sorry that we can't ever get to all the questions in the room, but it seems to me that one of the actions I had written down is been echoed today in a number of the comments, which is to respectfully and with humility observe non-Western mental health and well-being in natural settings. And that includes, of course, this idea that nature is not always kind or good. Or bucolic the way it is in the English countryside. So I'd like to end by thanking all of you so much for coming here. This is this is a really important area, really rapidly growing area, and I think all of us would invite you please to get in touch and tell us about your projects and your interests, and continue to give us your provocations, because that's really important to move this area forward. Thank you very much.